I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're watching over a child who isn't yours, setting a table for someone who never says thank you, or just hoping to be seen. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. In the sprawling hills of Los Angeles, where mansions rise like modern castles against the smoggy sky, there stood a house that seemed to mock the very notion of home. Behind its wrought iron gates and manicured gardens, beneath crystal chandeliers that cast cold rainbows across marble floors, lived a man who had everything money could buy, and nothing his heart truly needed. Robert Langston's fortune stretched beyond comprehension, built on decades of shrewd investments in real estate, technology stocks, and even cryptocurrency. His net worth, measured in the hundreds of millions, grew daily through dividends and compound interest, yet his life felt bankrupt of warmth. The silence in that mansion was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow echo of absence, the absence of laughter that came from the heart, of voices that spoke with tenderness rather than duty, of footsteps that hurried toward each other instead of away. Robert moved through his domain like a ghost haunting his own life, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against marble that reflected everything but offered no warmth. The sound seemed to mock him, each step a reminder of how far he had drifted from the man he once was. 2 years earlier, death had visited this house and stolen away Isabella, Robert's wife, leaving behind 2 8-year-old boys whose eyes had grown too serious too quickly. Michael and Luke, identical twins with their mother's gentle brown eyes and their father's stubborn chin, wandered through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid their voices might shatter the fragile peace their father seemed to require. Their laughter, when it came at all, sounded apologetic, quickly stifled by the oppressive weight of grief that hung over everything like Los Angeles smog. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Robert's black Mercedes pulled through the electronic gates at 6:30, earlier than usual, but still late enough that the day's warmth had given way to the cool embrace of dusk. He carried his briefcase with the weight of a man carrying the world, his shoulders bearing not just the burden of his business empire, but the crushing responsibility of raising 2 sons he barely knew how to reach. The stock market had closed up 3% that day, adding another million to his already obscene wealth, but the numbers on his portfolio felt as meaningless as the designer furniture that filled his empty rooms. As he stepped into the grand foyer, past the oil painting of Isabella that seemed to watch him with eyes full of unspoken reproach, Robert heard something that stopped him cold. It was the sound of laughter, real laughter, the kind that bubbles up from deep inside and cannot be contained or manufactured. It drifted down from the second floor like music he had forgotten how to hear, drawing him up the curved staircase with its hand-carved banister that had cost more than most people's annual salary. The sound led him to the twins' bedroom, a room Isabella had decorated with trains and airplanes and dreams of adventure. Through the partially open door, Robert saw her, Margaret Collins, the woman who had quietly slipped into their lives 2 years ago, and somehow, without anyone noticing, had become its beating heart. She sat cross-legged on the Persian rug between the twin beds, her simple cotton dress spread around her like flower petals, her hands dancing through the air as she wove a story about brave knights and magical forests. Michael and Luke hung on her every word, their eyes bright with wonder, their small bodies leaning toward her as if she were gravity itself. Margaret's voice was nothing special by conventional standards, not trained or polished like the private tutors Robert hired for the boys. It carried the soft accent of East Los Angeles, where she had grown up in a neighborhood where ice cream trucks played tinkling melodies and children drew hopscotch squares on cracked sidewalks. But there was something in her tone, a warmth that seemed to wrap around the children like a blanket fresh from the dryer, that made even Robert's frozen heart stir with recognition. This was what had been missing from his house, not just sound, but the music of genuine affection. Margaret Collins had arrived in their lives through the sterile efficiency of a domestic employment agency, her references impeccable but unrevealing. She was 42 years old, never married. With graying hair she kept pulled back in a simple bun and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. She lived in a small apartment in Boyle Heights, taking 2 buses and a metro line to reach the mansion each morning at 7 sharp. Her monthly salary, though generous by the standards of domestic work, represented barely a fraction of what Robert spent on wine for his business dinners. But money, as Robert was slowly learning, could not buy what Margaret brought to his household. She possessed something far more valuable than wealth, the ability to see straight into the souls of wounded children and offer exactly what they needed. When Michael had nightmares about losing his mother, Margaret would sit by his bedside, not offering empty platitudes, but simply being present, her hand cool against his fevered forehead. When Luke struggled with reading, she would patiently sound out words with him, celebrating each small victory as if he had conquered mountains. The routine Margaret had established was invisible to Robert, who left early for his downtown office and returned after dinner had been served and homework completed. He missed the morning rituals, how she would hum softly while preparing breakfast, how she would braid the boys' hair for school with gentle fingers that never pulled or pinched, how she would pack their lunchboxes with notes written in her careful cursive, "Have a brave day," or "Remember, you are loved." These small acts of tenderness cost nothing in dollars, but were worth everything in the currency of childhood security. He missed seeing how she transformed the sterile perfection of the mansion into something approaching warmth. She would open windows to let in the California sunshine, despite the housekeeper's complaints about dust. She would rearrange furniture to create cozy reading nooks, ignoring the interior designer's protests about disturbing the feng shui. Most importantly, she filled the silence with life, teaching the boys card games her own father had taught her, showing them how to make paper airplanes from discarded business documents, turning bath time into an adventure with stories of underwater kingdoms and brave mirror princes. The boys bloomed under her care, like flowers finally receiving proper sunlight. Their grades improved, not because she was a skilled tutor, but because she made them feel capable of learning. Their confidence grew not through expensive lessons or camps, but through her consistent belief in their goodness. She never spoke to them as if they were fragile creatures damaged by loss, but as complete human beings deserving of respect and joy. In her presence, they remembered how to be children again. But Margaret's own childhood had been shadowed by poverty and loss. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom house where extended family came and went like tide, where dinner might be beans and rice for the 4th night running, where Christmas presents came from the dollar store and were wrapped in newspaper comics. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beverly Hills, coming home with stories of marble bathrooms and walk-in closets bigger than their entire home. Margaret had promised herself she would never be bitter about the inequalities she witnessed, would never let resentment poison the love she had to offer. That love had been tested by tragedy. At 25, Margaret had given birth to a son, Daniel, whose father had disappeared before the baby's first breath. For 3 precious years, she had poured all her hopes and dreams into that beautiful boy, working double shifts as a restaurant server to afford daycare and doctor visits. Daniel had been everything to her, her morning sunshine, her evening star, her reason for believing in tomorrow. Then, in a moment that still haunted her dreams, a drunk driver had stolen him away, leaving Margaret with empty arms and a heart that felt as barren as a desert after drought. The years that followed had been a blur of grief and survival. Margaret had worked as a hotel housekeeper, a retail clerk, a caregiver for elderly clients, any job that allowed her to serve others without having to speak of her own loss. She had learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness, to discover purpose in making other people's lives a little brighter. When the employment agency had called about a position caring for twin boys, something in Margaret's chest had stirred, not hope exactly, but the faint possibility of usefulness. The first time she had seen Michael and Luke, hollow-eyed and clinging to each other in the aftermath of their mother's funeral, Margaret had recognized kindred spirits. They were children acquainted with loss, small souls learning too early that love could vanish without warning. She had not applied for the job to heal her own wounds, but she discovered that in nurturing these boys, some part of her own broken heart began to mend. They needed her, and she needed to be needed. It was a transaction that had nothing to do with the salary Robert deposited in her checking account each month. For 2 years, this arrangement had worked with clockwork precision. Margaret arrived each morning as Robert's taillights disappeared down the driveway, and she departed each evening before his headlights swept up it. They existed in parallel universes within the same house, their paths crossing only occasionally in hallways, or at the brief moments when he checked on the boys before bedtime. He knew her name, knew she was competent and trustworthy, knew the children seemed content in her care. But he had never really seen her, not as a whole person with dreams and sorrows and a capacity for love that exceeded her job description. The other staff treated Margaret with polite distance. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had worked for the family since before Isabella's death, maintained strict hierarchies. Margaret was the help, nothing more, nothing less. She ate her lunch alone in the breakfast nook, while Mrs. Chen dined with the gardener and pool maintenance man in the staff room. She was not included in the Christmas bonuses or summer barbecues. When visitors came to the house, she was expected to make herself invisible, to slip into the background like wallpaper. The message was clear. She belonged to the category of people who served, not people who mattered. The boys, absorbing these unspoken rules, had learned to compartmentalize their affection. They adored Margaret within the boundaries of their private world, their bedrooms, the yard, the quiet hours of afternoon homework. But when their father appeared, or when they went to school events or birthday parties in their circles of privilege, they instinctively understood that Margaret belonged to a different sphere. They would hug her goodbye in the morning with genuine warmth, then speak of their weekend plans with friends as if she would simply cease to exist until Monday morning. This invisibility had become Margaret's familiar pain. She had grown accustomed to loving without acknowledgement, to celebrating birthdays from the kitchen while parties happened in the dining room, to hearing herself referred to in the third person even when she stood 3 feet away. Has she given the boys their vitamins? Did she remember to pack the soccer gear? Make sure she knows about the early pickup tomorrow. Never Margaret. Never direct conversation, never recognition that she might have insights about the children she spent 10 hours a day nurturing. The loneliness of this existence was softened only by the genuine affection of Michael and Luke. They might not be able to publicly claim her as family, but in private moments, they offered her a devotion that filled some of the empty spaces in her heart. Michael would save her the last cookie from his school snack, carefully wrapped in a napkin, and presented with the ceremony of a state gift. Luke would draw her pictures of flowers and rainbows, signing them to Margaret Love Luke in his careful 8-year-old printing. These small treasures she kept in a shoebox under her bed, proof that her love was not entirely unreturned. But on that evening in early October, when Robert stood outside the boys' bedroom door and truly saw Margaret for the first time, the careful balance of their separate worlds began to shift. He watched her hands shape castles in the air, watched her face glow with the simple pleasure of making children smile, watched his sons lean into her warmth like moths drawn to flame. For the first time in 2 years, Robert witnessed what Isabella would have wanted to see, her children being loved not as obligations or burdens, but as gifts worthy of celebration. He crept away from the door without announcing himself, but something fundamental had changed. As he sat in his home office that night, reviewing profit reports and portfolio statements, Robert found his mind wandering to questions he had never thought to ask. Where had Margaret learned to tell stories with such captivating skill? What made her laugh, truly laugh, the way she had drawn laughter from his sons? What did she think about during those long bus rides to and from work? What dreams did she carry in her heart as she folded his children's clothes and sang them to sleep? For the first time since Isabella's death, Robert fell asleep thinking not about losses and failures, but about the possibility that healing might wear the most unexpected face. In the morning, he found himself lingering over coffee, hoping to catch a glimpse of Margaret's arrival, curious to see how she moved through his house when she thought no one was watching. The woman who had been invisible to him for 2 years was suddenly, inexplicably, impossible to ignore. 3 weeks later, on a fog-wrapped evening when Los Angeles wore winter's first gray coat, crisis struck the Langston household with the sudden violence that seemed to target children with special cruelty. Michael, the more adventurous of the twins, had convinced his brother to sneak outside after dinner to catch fireflies in the back garden. The property was vast, stretching across 2 acres of terraced landscaping that included hidden grottos, winding stone paths, and shadowy alcoves where even adults could lose their bearings. What began as innocent exploration became nightmare when Michael, chasing a particularly elusive flicker of light, wandered beyond the illuminated areas into the darker reaches of the estate. The fog that had rolled in from the Pacific Ocean created a disorienting maze of shadows and muffled sounds. Within minutes, the 8-year-old found himself completely lost, calling for his brother in a voice that grew thin with panic. The expensive landscaping that Robert's fortune had purchased, the imported Japanese maples, the hand-carved stone sculptures, the artistically placed boulders, became obstacles that confused rather than guided the frightened child. Luke was the first to raise the alarm, bursting through the French doors into the living room where Robert sat reviewing acquisition reports, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "Daddy, we can't find Michael. He's lost in the fog and it's getting dark and he's scared." The words tumbled out in a rush of terror, and Robert felt his blood crystallize into ice. In an instant, the quarterly profit margins that had occupied his attention seemed like meaningless marks on paper compared to the possibility of losing his son. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of frantic activity. Robert called the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, who promised to send units, but warned that response time might be delayed due to multiple evening emergencies. He activated the mansion's exterior lighting system, flooding the grounds with harsh artificial brightness that somehow made the fog seem even more impenetrable. Mrs. Chen woke the gardener and pool maintenance crew, pressing them into service for an expanding search that covered every inch of the manicured estate. But it was Margaret who truly understood what needed to be done. She had been in the kitchen preparing the next day's lunchboxes when Luke's cries reached her, and she had rushed to the living room in time to hear Robert shouting instructions into his phone. Without waiting for permission or direction, she grabbed a flashlight from the utility drawer and slipped outside, her heart guided by an instinct that transcended logic or protocol. While the others searched in organized grids, calling Michael's name and expecting rational responses from a terrified 8-year-old, Margaret let her maternal intuition guide her steps. She knew Michael's patterns, understood his hiding places, could think like a frightened child rather than a panicked adult. She moved beyond the manicured areas toward the property's border, where the landscaping gave way to native California scrub, and the neighbor's fence created dark corridors that might appeal to a boy's sense of adventure. She found him huddled against the wrought iron fence that separated the Langston estate from the hillside beyond, his small body shaking with cold and fear. His Superman pajamas were torn from brambles, his bare feet scratched from wandering across rough stone and thorny ground. When Margaret's flashlight beam illuminated his tear-streaked face, the relief that flooded through her was so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. "Michael, sweetheart, I'm here," she called softly, approaching him like a wounded animal that might bolt if startled. "You're safe now. I'm going to take you home." She shed her cardigan sweater and wrapped it around his trembling shoulders, gathering him into her arms with a tenderness that came from the deepest well of maternal love. He clung to her neck with desperate fingers, his sobs muffled against her shoulder as she carried him across the dark garden toward the beacon of house lights. When they emerged from the fog into the circle of artificial brightness, Margaret looked like a wartime nurse carrying a wounded soldier to safety. Her hair had escaped its usual neat bun. Her simple dress was stained with dirt and moisture, but her face radiated the fierce satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Michael wrapped around her like a koala bear, his faith in her protection absolute and unshakable. Robert's first emotion was pure relief. His son was safe, unharmed beyond scratches that would heal in days. But as he watched Margaret surrender the boy to his reaching arms, as he saw the way Michael's eyes lingered on her face with gratitude and trust, Robert felt something crack open inside his chest. This woman, whom he had barely acknowledged for 2 years, had risked her own safety to save his child. She had ventured into darkness without hesitation, guided by nothing but love and determination. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate to express what he owed her. Margaret nodded, her breathing still uneven from exertion and adrenaline, then stepped back to allow the family their reunion. She was already withdrawing into her familiar invisibility when Robert caught her arm gently. "No, really. Thank you. I don't know how to—" He struggled for words, this man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals with eloquent precision. "You saved him. You brought him home." Margaret's smile was tired but genuine. "He's a good boy. Boys need to explore, but they also need someone to bring them back when they have gone too far." Her simple wisdom carried depths Robert was only beginning to fathom. As she gathered the flashlight and her scattered composure, preparing to retreat to her separate sphere, Robert found himself reluctant to let the moment end. "Margaret," he called, surprising them both with his use of her name. Would you stay with him tonight, just until he falls asleep? I think he might need—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but she understood. "Of course, Mr. Langston. I'll take care of him." And she did, settling into the chair beside Michael's bed, her presence a guardian angel against the nightmares that might come. She sang him soft Mexican lullabies her own mother had sung to her, her voice weaving a cocoon of safety around the frightened child. When sleep finally claimed him, she remained for another hour, watching over his dreams like a sentry on duty. From the hallway, Robert watched through the partially open door, seeing Margaret's silhouette against the nightlight's glow. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember Isabella's voice, murmuring similar songs, her figure outlined by similar shadows. But instead of the crushing grief that usually accompanied such memories, he felt something else, a recognition that love could take different forms and still be real, still be precious, still be worthy of gratitude. That night marked the beginning of a subtle transformation in the Langston household. Robert began to notice things he had been blind to for months, the way Margaret anticipated the boys' needs before they expressed them, the gentle efficiency with which she managed their schedules and moods, the 1,000 small kindnesses that turned a house into something approaching home. He started arriving earlier from work, not to check on her performance, but to witness the magic she worked in the ordinary moments of childcare. He saw her teaching the boys to fold fitted sheets, turning a mundane chore into a game of geometry and teamwork. He watched her bandage scraped knees with the seriousness of a battlefield surgeon, complete with stickers that transformed wounds into badges of bravery. He observed her listening to their endless chatter about school politics and playground drama with the same attention she might give to matters of international importance. In her presence, Michael and Luke became fully themselves, funny, creative, occasionally naughty, always loved. But perhaps most importantly, Robert began to see Margaret's own humanity. He noticed the way she paused sometimes while folding laundry, her hand resting briefly on a small shirt, as if blessing it. He glimpsed the careful way she packed away outgrown clothes, treating each discarded garment with the reverence of archived memory. He saw her slip extra snacks into the boys' backpacks on days when they seemed particularly tired or stressed, her intuition reading their needs like a barometer reading atmospheric pressure. One afternoon in late November, as autumn painted the canyon in shades of gold and rust, Robert found himself lingering in the kitchen while Margaret prepared after-school snacks. The boys were in the garden, raking leaves into jumping piles under the watchful eye of the gardener. Sunlight slanted through the windows, warming the granite countertops and casting dancing patterns on the walls. For the first time in this house, Robert felt something approaching peace. "Margaret," he said quietly, testing the waters of genuine conversation, "how did you learn to be so good with children? It's like you understand them instinctively." She looked up from slicing apples, her knife pausing in mid-motion. For a moment, he thought she might deflect the question with the professional pleasantries that usually characterized their interactions, but something in his tone, perhaps, or the gentle curiosity in his eyes, seemed to unlock a door she normally kept closed. "I had a little boy once," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of old sorrow. "Daniel. He would have been 11 now." She resumed cutting the apple, her movements precise and economical, but Robert could see the tremor in her hands that spoke of emotions carefully contained. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "What happened?" Margaret set down the knife and looked out the window toward where his sons played in unconscious safety. "A drunk driver. Daniel was 3. The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if she had learned to drain them of emotion in order to survive their telling. "He was everything to me, my whole world, my future, my reason for getting up in the morning. When I lost him, I thought I was lost too." Robert felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He had never considered that Margaret might carry her own grief, her own experiences with the sudden violence of loss. In his self-absorption, he had assumed her competence with children came from training or natural inclination, never imagining it might be built on a foundation of understanding exactly how precious and fragile those young lives were. How do you keep going?" he asked, surprised by his own vulnerability in the question. Margaret smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "I learned that love doesn't just disappear when the person is gone. It has to go somewhere, find a new purpose. Daniel taught me how to love a child completely, and that knowledge didn't die with him. It just found a new home." She glanced toward the window again, where Michael and Luke were now engaged in an elaborate leaf-throwing battle. "Your boys gave my love a place to live again." In that moment, Robert understood something that changed everything. Margaret wasn't just an employee who happened to be good at her job. She was a woman who had transformed devastating loss into redemptive service, who had taken her broken heart and used it as a compass to find other children who needed exactly what she had to offer. Her love for Michael and Luke wasn't professional duty. It was sacred calling, born from the ashes of her own motherhood. "They're lucky to have you," he said simply, but the words carried new weight and meaning. "I'm lucky to have them," she replied, and Robert believed her completely. As winter deepened and the holidays approached, the atmosphere in the mansion continued to evolve. Robert made small but significant changes, inviting Margaret to join them for dinner occasionally, asking her opinion on weekend activities for the boys, including her in decisions about their education and extracurricular activities. Nothing dramatic or obvious, but enough to signal that her insights were valued, her presence appreciated. Margaret bloomed under this recognition like a desert plant receiving unexpected rain. She began to offer suggestions more freely, to share stories from her own childhood that delighted the boys, to treat Robert more like a partner in parenting than an employer to be carefully managed. The rigid boundaries that had defined their relationship slowly softened without disappearing entirely. Christmas that year was different from the austere observances that had marked the previous 2 holidays. Margaret's influence could be felt in the handmade ornaments that appeared on the professionally decorated tree, in the batch of homemade cookies that filled the kitchen with cinnamon and vanilla, in the tradition of reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" that she had gently suggested. For the first time since Isabella's death, the house felt alive during the holiday season. But even as harmony settled over the Langston household like snow over a peaceful landscape, forces of disruption were gathering strength. Mrs. Chen had watched Margaret's growing influence with increasing resentment, feeling her own authority threatened by the nanny's expanding role. The housekeeper had worked for wealthy families long enough to understand the rigid protocols that govern such relationships, and Margaret's ascension from invisible servant to trusted confidant violated every rule Mrs. Chen held sacred. The catalyst came in the form of Sandra Morrison, Robert's sister-in-law, who visited for New Year's weekend with her own children and her arsenal of opinions about proper household management. Sandra had never approved of Robert's hands-off approach to parenting, had always believed that wealthy children needed more discipline and less indulgence. She viewed Margaret's warm relationship with the boys as a dangerous precedent that would spoil them for the realities of privilege and responsibility. "You're letting that woman overstep her bounds, Robert," Sandra announced over dinner on New Year's Eve, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "She's forgotten her place in this household. The help should be helpful, not familial." The boys had already been excused to watch movies in the family room, but Margaret was in the kitchen close enough to hear every word. Mrs. Chen, serving the main course, cast meaningful glances in the nanny's direction, her expression communicating clear agreement with Sandra's assessment. "Margaret is wonderful with the children," Robert replied carefully, not wanting to create family conflict, but unwilling to let the criticism pass unchallenged. "She loves them, and they love her." "That's precisely the problem," Sandra continued, warming to her theme. "Children shouldn't form emotional attachments to domestic staff. What happens when you need to replace her? What happens when they go to boarding school and she's not there to coddle them? You're doing them no favors by allowing this inappropriate bonding." Robert felt the conversation veering into territory that made him uncomfortable, but he lacked the vocabulary to defend what he couldn't fully define. Was Margaret family? Was she staff? Could she be both? The questions seemed unanswerable under Sandra's withering scrutiny and Mrs. Chen's approving nods. He mumbled something about reviewing the situation and changed the subject to business matters, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, that seed grew with the persistence of a weed in fertile soil. Sandra's words echoed in Robert's mind during quiet moments, reinforced by subtle comments from Mrs. Chen and questioning looks from other parents at school events. He began to notice things that had previously escaped his attention: how other nannies maintained more formal relationships with their charges, how his business associates spoke of their domestic staff with cool professionalism, how the boundaries in his household had indeed become unusually blurred. The situation reached a crisis point on a rainy Tuesday in February, when Mrs. Chen discovered Margaret reading bedtime stories to the boys from Isabella's old chair, the pale blue armchair that had been his wife's favorite spot for evening reading. In Mrs. Chen's mind, this was not just boundary crossing, but sacred violation. She marched into Robert's home office with righteous indignation blazing in her eyes. "Mr. Langston, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I must speak frankly. That woman has completely forgotten her station. Tonight, I found her sitting in your dear wife's chair, acting like she's the lady of the house. It's disrespectful to Mrs. Isabella's memory and inappropriate for someone in her position. Something must be done before she completely takes over your household." Robert looked up from the financial reports spread across his desk, Mrs. Chen's words hitting him like a physical blow. The chair, Isabella's chair, sacred territory that had remained untouched since her death. The thought of Margaret sitting there, of the boys accepting her in that space, so loaded with memory and meaning, sent a surge of something raw and painful through his chest. Was it betrayal, desecration, or was it something else? Guilt at how much he had begun to depend on Margaret's presence, fear that his feelings for her were growing beyond the boundaries of employer and employee? "I see," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had characterized his recent interactions with Margaret. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mrs. Chen. I'll handle it." But handling it proved more complicated than Robert had anticipated. Over the next several days, he found himself watching Margaret with new eyes, looking for evidence of overreach or presumption. He saw her help Luke with homework in the dining room, where important business dinners had been held. He noticed her teaching Michael card games on the Persian rug, worth more than most people's cars. He observed her humming while she organized closets with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged in those spaces. Each observation fed the growing anxiety that perhaps Sandra and Mrs. Chen were right. Perhaps he had been too permissive, too grateful, too blind to the dangers of allowing boundaries to dissolve. Perhaps in his grief and loneliness, he had projected onto Margaret qualities and meanings that existed more in his imagination than in reality. Perhaps what he had interpreted as healing love was actually calculating manipulation by a woman who understood exactly how to exploit a widower's vulnerability. The thought made Robert feel sick, but once planted, it grew with vicious speed. He began to remember moments differently. Was Margaret's rescue of Michael heroic dedication or the calculated act of someone cementing her indispensable status? Were her stories and songs genuine expressions of affection or carefully orchestrated performances designed to bind the children to her emotionally? Had her confidences about her lost son been honest sharing or strategic revelation intended to gain his sympathy and trust? The paranoia built to an unbearable crescendo on a Thursday evening in early March when Robert returned from work to find Margaret teaching the boys to cook in the giant kitchen that had been Isabella's domain. They were making pancakes for dinner, a meal Isabella used to prepare whenever the boys needed extra comfort. Flour dusted every surface, laughter filled the air, and Michael and Luke looked happier than Robert had seen them in months. But all he could see was another boundary crossed, another sacred space invaded. Another piece of his wife's legacy being overwritten by Margaret's assumptions of belonging. "What is this?" he asked sharply, his voice cutting through the domestic harmony like a blade through silk. The laughter stopped immediately. Michael and Luke froze in the middle of flipping pancakes, their faces shifting from joy to confusion to guarded fear. Margaret turned from the stove, her expression showing that she heard not just his words, but the coldness behind them. "The boys asked if we could make dinner together," she said carefully, her voice steady but her hands betraying her nervousness as she twisted the dish towel. "They said their mother used to make pancakes when they were sad about something at school." "My wife," Robert said with emphasis that turned the words into weapons, "made pancakes in this kitchen. This is her space. These are her recipes. You are not her replacement." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sizzle of batter on the hot griddle and the quiet sounds of two boys trying not to cry. Margaret's face went very pale, but her dignity remained intact. "Of course not, Mr. Langston. I would never presume to replace anyone. I was just trying to help the children feel better about their difficult day." She turned off the burner and began cleaning up the flour and eggshells with efficient movements, her composure a sharp contrast to the emotional devastation Robert could see in her eyes. "Maybe that's the problem," Robert continued, his voice growing colder as guilt and confusion drove him to inflict more wounds. "Maybe you've been trying to help in ways that aren't appropriate for someone in your position. Maybe it's time we remembered exactly what your job is supposed to be." The boys stared at their father with expressions of dawning horror, unable to understand why their safe, warm evening had suddenly turned into something frightening and ugly. Michael, braver than his brother, spoke up in a voice that quavered with defensive loyalty. "Margaret was just helping us, Daddy. We asked her to teach us. We wanted to make dinner like Mommy used to." His small face was streaked with tears, his 8-year-old heart breaking at the injustice being visited on his beloved caregiver. "Go to your rooms," Robert commanded, his parental authority crushing all protest. "Both of you, now." The boys fled without argument, their feet pounding up the stairs like retreating soldiers. Their departure left Robert alone with Margaret in the destroyed kitchen, flour settling on granite countertops like ash after a fire. "I'm sorry, Mr. Langston," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying decades of practice at absorbing blame that wasn't entirely hers to bear. "I didn't mean to overstep. I was just trying to make them happy." "That's just it," Robert replied, his anger fueled by self-loathing and confusion he couldn't untangle. It's not your job to make them happy. It's your job to care for them during the hours I'm not here. Nothing more, nothing less. I think we've all lost sight of that fact. Margaret nodded once, her movements careful and controlled, then resumed cleaning up the mess of their interrupted cooking lesson. Each motion was precise and economical, betraying none of the emotional chaos Robert suspected was raging inside her. He wanted to take back his words, to apologize for the cruelty he saw reflected in her downcast eyes, but pride and fear held his tongue prisoner. "Perhaps," Margaret said eventually, not looking at him while she wiped down counters with methodical strokes, "it would be better if I found another position, if my presence has become a problem for your family." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, but instead of the relief he expected to feel, panic flooded his system. The thought of Margaret leaving, of the house returning to its previous emptiness, of facing his son's inevitable grief and anger, sent him spiraling into new depths of confused emotion. But admitting that would mean acknowledging how much he had come to depend on her, how much her presence had meant not just to the children, but to him. And that acknowledgement felt too dangerous, too laden with implications he wasn't ready to face. "No," he said quickly, then forced his voice into more measured tones. "No, that won't be necessary. We just need to clarify expectations, maintain appropriate boundaries. I'm sure we can work this out." But the damage had been done. The trust that had been building slowly over months was shattered in minutes, replaced by a careful formality that felt like winter settling over what had been the beginning of spring. Margaret continued her duties with professional competence, but the warmth was gone, the easy laughter silenced, the sense of family fractured. The boys sensed the change immediately and responded with the wounded confusion of children who had lost something precious without understanding why. Over the following weeks, Robert watched his household return to its previous sterile efficiency and realized he had made a terrible mistake. But pride and uncertainty kept him from addressing the situation directly. Instead, he found himself caught in an increasingly uncomfortable middle ground, missing Margaret's warmth while maintaining the distance he had demanded, wanting to repair the relationship while lacking the vocabulary to explain his own complex emotions. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Sandra, visiting again in late March, had introduced a friend, Janet Morrison, a domestic placement specialist who knew how to handle staff properly. Janet, sensing opportunity in the household's obvious tension, began dropping subtle comments about Margaret's suitability for the position. She suggested that perhaps someone with more formal training would be better for children of Robert's social standing. She mentioned other nannies who understood the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Most damagingly, she planted seeds of doubt about Margaret's motivations and background. "Have you thoroughly investigated her references?" Janet asked over wine one evening, while Margaret helped the boys with homework in the next room. Sometimes, women who have lost children can become overly attached to their charges. It's not healthy for anyone involved. The comment struck at Robert's deepest fears. Was Margaret's love for his sons genuine nurturing or pathological replacement of her lost child? Was her growing place in their lives healing integration or dangerous substitution? The questions tormented him during sleepless nights and distracted days, poisoning every interaction with suspicion and second-guessing. When the final crisis came, it arrived wrapped in the mundane clothing of a school permission slip. Margaret had signed Michael's field trip form when Robert wasn't available to approve it, using the emergency contact authorization he had given her months earlier. It was exactly the kind of practical decision-making that had made her invaluable to the household's smooth operation. But Mrs. Chen, still smarting from Margaret's elevated status, presented it to Robert as evidence of dangerous overreach. She signed school documents as if she were family, Mrs. Chen reported with barely concealed satisfaction. The school secretary even asked if Margaret was the new Mrs. Langston. It's completely inappropriate for hired help to present herself as having that kind of authority. The comment about the new Mrs. Langston hit Robert like a sledgehammer to the chest. Was that how people saw Margaret's role in his household? Was that how she saw herself? The thought sent him into a spiral of embarrassment and anger that had little to do with permission slips and everything to do with his own confused feelings about the woman who had quietly become essential to his family's functioning. That night, Robert made the decision that would haunt him for months to come. He called Margaret into his office after the boys were asleep, his resolve hardened by wine and wounded pride. She entered with the wariness of someone who had learned to recognize danger in the shifting atmospheres of wealthy households. "Margaret, I've been doing some thinking about our arrangement," he began, his voice artificially formal. "I think perhaps it's time for a change. The boys are getting older, they need different things, and I think it might be better for everyone if we made other arrangements." It was the coward's approach, vague, indirect, allowing her to fill in the blanks rather than stating plainly what he was trying to do. Margaret stood very still for a long moment, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the dignity of someone who had faced rejection before and survived it. "I understand, Mr. Langston. When would you like me to leave?" The question was simple, practical, but it struck Robert with unexpected force. When did he want her to leave? "Never," his heart answered immediately. "Tomorrow," his wounded pride demanded. The conflict between these impulses left him speechless for several seconds too long. 2 weeks should be sufficient notice, he finally managed, hating himself and hating her and hating the situation that had brought them to this impossible moment. Margaret nodded once, as if filing away important information. "I'll prepare a detailed report of the boys' routines and preferences for whoever comes next, and I'll try to explain to them that this is what's best for their development." Her professionalism in the face of what amounted to emotional abandonment only made Robert feel worse. He had expected anger, tears, pleading, reactions that would have justified his decision and made him feel righteous rather than cruel. Instead, he got grace under pressure, dignity in defeat, and the unsettling sense that she understood him better than he understood himself. "Thank you," he said awkwardly. "I'll provide excellent references, of course, and if you need time to find another position." "That's very kind," Margaret interrupted gently, "but I'll be fine. I always am." The conversation ended there, both of them recognizing that anything more would only deepen the wounds being inflicted. Margaret left his office with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and Robert sat alone with his financial reports, trying to convince himself he had made the right decision for everyone involved. The numbers on the pages blurred together as he realized that for the first time in his business career, he had made a decision that felt fundamentally wrong even as he executed it. The next 2 weeks passed like a slow-motion disaster. Robert watched Margaret prepare for her departure with methodical efficiency, organizing years of accumulated knowledge about his sons into neat files and detailed notes. She trained her replacement, a stern woman named Miss Patterson, whom Janet Morrison had recommended, with generous patience, despite knowing she was essentially training her own successor in the art of loving his children. Most painfully, he watched her explain to Michael and Luke that she would be leaving, her voice steady and reassuring even as their world crumbled around them. She told them it was time for them to have new experiences with someone who could teach them different things, that growing up meant learning to say goodbye to people you love, that her feelings for them would never change even if she couldn't be with them every day. The boys' reaction was immediate and devastating. They clung to her with desperate fingers, promising to be better, to never again make noise during her stories, to never ask for anything extra if only she would stay. Their tears soaked her simple dresses, their pleas tore at her composure, and their desperate bargaining broke something in Robert's chest that he hadn't known was whole. "Why is Daddy making you leave?" Michael asked with the directness of childhood innocence. "Did we do something wrong? Did you do something wrong?" Margaret's answer was a masterpiece of protective love. Sometimes, sweetheart, adults have to make difficult decisions about what they think is best for children. Your daddy loves you very much, and he believes this change will be good for you as you grow up. My job was always to take care of you until you were old enough to need different kinds of care. Luke, younger but equally perceptive, pressed deeper. But don't you love us? Don't you want to stay with us forever? This question nearly broke Margaret's composure entirely. Robert, watching from the hallway where he thought himself hidden, saw her face crumple for just an instant before she regained control. Her answer came in a whisper that carried across the house like a prayer. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the fish in the ocean, more than all the leaves on all the trees in the whole world. That love doesn't go away when people go away. It lives in your heart forever. And wherever I am, I'll be loving you every single day. On Margaret's final evening, she did something that would haunt Robert for months afterward. She knocked on his office door and asked if she might have a word with him privately. He looked up from his computer, where he had been pretending to work while actually counting down the hours until his family's dissolution was complete. What can I do for you, Margaret? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. She held out a thick manila envelope with both hands, as if presenting an offering. I wanted to give you this before I go. It's something I've been keeping for the boys. Pictures, drawings, little notes about their milestones and achievements. I thought perhaps someday they might want to know about their childhood from someone who witnessed every day of it. Robert took the envelope with reluctant hands, immediately struck by its weight and thickness. Inside, he knew, lay evidence of the 1,000 moments he had missed while building his fortune and nursing his grief. The first steps, the first words, the favorite games, the bedtime fears, the afternoon discoveries. All of it documented by someone who had recognized its importance even when he had not. Margaret, he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please don't go. I need you. The children need you. We all need you. The words crowded in his throat, but pride and confusion kept them locked away. It's all right, Mr. Langston, she said softly, as if she could hear his unexpressed thoughts. I understand why you felt this was necessary. You're protecting your family the best way you know how. I respect that, even if it hurts. Her forgiveness felt worse than anger would have. Robert wanted her to rage at him, to reveal some flaw in her character that would justify his decision. Instead, she offered him grace he didn't deserve, and understanding he couldn't reciprocate. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life, diminished by her dignity and his own cowardice. I hope, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, that whoever takes care of them next will love them the way they deserve to be loved. They're special boys, Mr. Langston. They have your intelligence and their mother's kindness. They're going to do wonderful things in this world. She left then, without fanfare or final speeches, carrying a single suitcase and the faded photograph of the twins she had kept for 2 years. Robert stood at his office window and watched her small figure disappear down the driveway, swallowed by the Los Angeles evening that offered no comfort or redemption. For the first time since Isabella's death, he cried, not for his wife, but for the living woman he had just allowed to walk out of his life and his children's hearts. Miss Patterson arrived the next morning with credentials and references and a brisk efficiency that should have been reassuring. She established schedules and routines with military precision, maintained proper boundaries with professional skill, and managed the boys' daily needs with competent expertise. She was everything Robert thought he wanted in a caregiver: formal, distant, appropriately focused on practical matters rather than emotional connection. Within a week, the Langston household had returned to its previous state of sterile order. Meals were served on time, laundry was folded and put away with geometric precision, homework was completed under strict supervision, and bedtimes were enforced without negotiation or flexibility. Miss Patterson maintained perfect boundaries. She was clearly staff, the boys were clearly charges, and Robert was clearly the employer. No one's role was ambiguous or confusing, but something vital had left the house with Margaret, and its absence grew more oppressive every day. The boys moved through their routines with mechanical compliance, their natural exuberance dampened by grief and confusion. They ate their perfectly nutritious meals without enthusiasm, completed their assignments without creativity, and went to bed without the laughter or songs that had once filled the evening hours. Miss Patterson managed their behavior, but could not reach their hearts, supervise their activities, but could not inspire their joy. Robert found himself listening for sounds that no longer came. Margaret's soft humming from the kitchen, the boys' excited chatter as they shared their discoveries with someone who genuinely cared to hear them, the easy warmth that had gradually transformed his house from mausoleum to home. Miss Patterson's efficiency was admirable but cold, her competence impressive but soulless. She did her job exactly as prescribed, nothing more and nothing less. Within a month, the boys' personalities began to change in ways that alarmed their father. Michael, once adventurous and outgoing, became sullen and withdrawn. Luke, previously eager and affectionate, grew clingy and fearful. They stopped running to greet Robert when he came home from work, stopped sharing stories from their days, stopped asking for extra bedtime stories or weekend adventures. Their world had shrunk to the narrow confines of duty and routine, drained of the spontaneous love that had made it expansive and magical. The house itself seemed to reflect this emotional winter. Rooms that had grown warm and welcoming under Margaret's influence reverted to their previous museum-like sterility. Flowers were no longer picked from the garden to brighten kitchen tables. Windows remained closed, blocking out the sunshine and fresh air that might disturb the perfect climate control. The very walls seemed to echo with absence, reminding Robert of what he had lost even as he tried to convince himself he had made the right choice. School reports began to reflect the boys' emotional state. Teachers noted decreased engagement, lack of enthusiasm for projects that had once excited them, and a general withdrawal from social interactions with classmates. Both boys' grades remained acceptable. Miss Patterson ensured homework was completed, but the creativity and spark that had marked their previous academic work was notably absent. They had become dutiful students rather than eager learners, fulfilling requirements without embracing possibilities. Robert tried to bridge the growing distance between himself and his sons through traditional father-son activities, baseball games, fishing trips, expensive outings to theme parks and sporting events. But these adventures felt forced and artificial, missing the natural ease that had characterized family life when Margaret's warmth had infused every interaction. The boys participated politely, but without genuine enthusiasm, their hearts clearly elsewhere. Most painfully for Robert, he began to discover just how much Margaret had done that he had never noticed or appreciated. She had been the family's emotional translator, helping him understand his son's moods and needs. She had been their comfort in small crises, their cheerleader in daily victories, their soft place to land when the world felt harsh or confusing. She had been the keeper of their memories, the narrator of their stories, the witness to their growth who made each moment feel significant rather than routine. Miss Patterson managed their physical needs with impressive competence, but had no interest in their emotional worlds. She served protein and vegetables without regard for favorite flavors, enforced bedtimes without flexibility for special circumstances, and supervised activities without enthusiasm for their discoveries. She was a perfect employee by conventional standards, but she was not and could never be what Margaret had been, a loving presence who had transformed service into calling, duty into devotion. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in May, when Robert returned from work early to find both boys sitting silently in the family room, staring at a television neither seemed to be actually watching. Miss Patterson was in the kitchen, efficiently preparing dinner while counting down the minutes until her workday ended. The contrast with afternoons he remembered from Margaret's tenure was stark and heartbreaking. No laughter, no conversation, no sense of shared experience or mutual affection. That evening, after Miss Patterson had departed and the boys had gone through their bedtime routines with mechanical precision, Robert sat alone in his office and forced himself to confront what his pride had cost his family. He opened the manila envelope Margaret had given him on her final evening, spreading its contents across his desk like evidence in a case he was finally ready to examine honestly. The photographs told a story he had never bothered to learn, his son's journey from toddlers to children, captured not in formal poses, but in moments of genuine life. Margaret had documented their first successful bike rides, their excited faces on Christmas mornings, their proud expressions when they mastered new skills. She had preserved their artwork, their funny comments, their questions about the world, their expressions of love for family members both present and gone. But it was Margaret's handwritten notes that truly broke Robert's heart. She had recorded not just milestones, but motivations, not just achievements, but aspirations. She had noticed that Michael loved stories about brave knights because he wanted to feel strong enough to protect people he cared about. She had observed that Luke collected smooth stones because he found comfort in beautiful things he could hold in his pocket. She had understood that both boys needed extra reassurance on stormy nights because their mother had died during a thunderstorm, and she had provided that comfort without ever being asked to do so. Reading her careful documentation of his son's inner lives, Robert realized he had fired not just a competent employee, but a loving chronicler of his family's most precious years. She had seen his children not as duties to be managed, but as unique individuals whose thoughts, fears, dreams, and discoveries were worthy of attention and preservation. She had loved them with the fierce protective tenderness of someone who understood exactly how fragile and precious childhood could be. Most devastating was Margaret's final entry, dated the day before he had dismissed her. Michael asked tonight if I think his daddy loves him, even though he's sad all the time. Luke worried that he's not good enough because his daddy doesn't smile when he sees them. I told them that grief can make love harder to express, but never makes it less real. I hope someday Mr. Langston finds his way back to showing these beautiful boys how much they matter to him. They need him to see them the way I see them, as miracles who deserve to feel cherished every single day. Robert read those words 3 times before their full import hit him. Margaret had been worried not just about the boys' immediate needs, but about their relationship with their father. She had been working to bridge the gap between them, to help them understand his distance while gently encouraging him to overcome it. He had interpreted her growing influence as a threat to his authority when it had actually been an attempt to restore his connection to his children. That night, Robert lay awake staring at the ceiling and forced himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding for months. He missed Margaret, not just for what she did for his children, but for what she had brought to his own life. Her presence had made him feel less alone, less burdened by the weight of single parenthood, less trapped in the prison of his own grief and confusion. She had been patient with his emotional limitations, supportive of his fumbling attempts at fatherhood, and generous with her understanding even when he had failed to reciprocate. More than that, he had been falling in love with her, slowly, carefully, terrified by the implications and guilty about the betrayal it seemed to represent to Isabella's memory. But instead of examining those feelings honestly and working through their complexity, he had allowed fear and social pressure to drive him toward cruelty and rejection. He had chosen to destroy what might have been beautiful rather than risk the vulnerability of admitting his need for another person's love. The next morning, Robert made a decision that had been weeks in the making. He called in sick to work, something he hadn't done in more than 5 years, and spent the day driving through East Los Angeles, searching for the woman he had cast out of his family's life. He visited the community center where he remembered Margaret mentioning she had once volunteered, but the staff there hadn't seen her in months. He tried the addresses he could find in employment records, but most led to dead ends or people who knew her only vaguely. Finally, as the afternoon wore toward evening, Robert found himself at a small elementary school in Boyle Heights, where after-school tutoring programs were winding down for the day. A maintenance worker recognized Margaret's description and pointed him toward a classroom where volunteer reading tutors met with struggling students. Through the window, Robert saw her sitting at a child-sized table, her dark head bent close to a little boy who was sounding out words in a picture book. Watching her work with that unknown child, patient, encouraging, completely focused on his small struggles and victories, Robert felt the last of his doubts crumble. This was who Margaret truly was, a woman who existed to nurture, to teach, to love unconditionally and without expectation of reward. She had brought that same spirit to his children, had poured herself into their development and happiness, not because it was her job, but because it was her calling. He had been blessed to have her in their lives, and he had thrown that blessing away because of fear, pride, and social pressure. The tutoring session ended, and Robert watched Margaret help the little boy pack his backpack and gather his coat. She walked him to the hallway where his grandmother waited, the two women exchanging quick updates about his progress and scheduling his next session. When the child was safely delivered, Margaret turned back toward the classroom and froze at the sight of Robert standing awkwardly in the doorway. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the empty hallway. Margaret's expression showed surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before discipline locked it away. She looked tired, more tired than he remembered, and there was a sadness around her eyes that hadn't been there during her tenure with his family. But her dignity remained intact, her composure unshaken by his unexpected appearance. "Mr. Langston," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right with the boys?" The question cut straight to the heart of why he had come searching for her. No, everything was not all right with the boys. Nothing had been all right since she had left their lives. The house was cold, the children were withdrawn, and he was finally ready to admit that his attempt to maintain proper boundaries had destroyed something precious that could never be replaced by professional competence alone. "No," he said simply, his voice catching on the single syllable. "Nothing is all right. I made a terrible mistake, Margaret, the worst mistake of my life, and I came here to ask, to beg, if necessary, for your forgiveness and a chance to make things right." Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly, revealing glimpses of the hurt he had inflicted and the love she had been forced to suppress. She glanced around the empty hallway, perhaps checking for witnesses to what felt like a moment too private for public consumption. "Mr. Langston, she began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to respond to his unexpected vulnerability. "Please," Robert interrupted, stepping closer but respecting the distance her body language demanded. "Just let me say what I came here to say. Let me try to explain and apologize and maybe find a way back from the damage I've done." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. We could talk there if you'd like." 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a small cafe that smelled of fresh bread and strong coffee, two people whose lives had been intimately connected, but who now felt like strangers navigating unfamiliar territory. Robert ordered coffee he didn't want, Margaret accepted tea she barely touched, and for several minutes neither spoke, each waiting for the other to begin a conversation that felt impossibly difficult and absolutely necessary. "I've been thinking about what you said," Robert finally offered, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup for warmth and comfort. "About the boys needing to see themselves the way you saw them, and I realized I never learned to do that, not just with them, but with anyone. I spent so many years focused on business, on building wealth and securing their future, that I forgot how to see the people right in front of me." Margaret listened without interrupting, her face reflecting careful attention but guarded hope. She had been hurt too deeply and recently to let optimism bloom without concrete evidence of change. "When Isabella died," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm, "I thought the answer was to protect them from more loss, more disappointment, more reasons to grieve. I kept everyone at a distance, including them, including myself. But you came into our lives and showed them it was safe to love again, safe to trust again, safe to be children again. And instead of being grateful for that gift, I got scared. Scared of what? Margaret asked softly, the first words she had spoken since they sat down. Robert considered the question seriously, recognizing it as an invitation to true honesty rather than comfortable explanations. Scared of needing you. Scared of what people would say about our relationship. Scared of betraying Isabella's memory by caring about another woman. Scared of admitting that you had become essential to our happiness when I was supposed to be strong enough to handle everything alone. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained. And what changed? Why are you here now? Because I've spent the last 3 months watching my sons become shadows of themselves, Robert answered without hesitation. Because the house feels like a tomb without your warmth in it. Because I finally read the notes you kept about their childhood and realized you knew them better than I did, loved them better than I was capable of at the time. They need you, Margaret. I need you. We're a family who lost our way, and you're the compass that can help us find it again. Tears were swimming in Margaret's eyes now, though she struggled to maintain her composure. What about the boundaries, the propriety, the concerns about my getting too attached? Robert leaned forward, his voice intense with conviction. I was an idiot. I let other people's opinions matter more than my family's happiness. I let pride and fear drive me to hurt the person who had shown us nothing but love and loyalty. There's nothing proper about children grieving for someone who was taken from them unjustly. There's nothing appropriate about a house that's perfectly managed but emotionally dead. He reached across the small table and gently took her hands in his, surprised by how natural the contact felt despite the months of separation. Margaret, you're not just a nanny to those boys. You're not just an employee to me. You're family, the most important kind of family, the kind you choose and earn through love rather than accident of birth. Margaret's tears were flowing freely now, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. I never forgot you, you know. Any of you. I've carried Michael and Luke in my heart every single day since I left. I've wondered about their schoolwork, their friendships, their dreams. I've missed tucking them in at night, missed their questions about everything, missed being part of their daily adventures. Then come home, Robert said simply, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Come back to us. Help me be the father they deserve. Help me create the kind of family where love is celebrated instead of feared, where boundaries exist to protect rather than divide. He paused, gathering courage for the most important words. Help me discover if what I've been feeling for you is real and worth exploring, or if I've been fooling myself about possibilities neither of us dared to name. Margaret was quiet for a long time, her hands still resting in his while she processed the weight of what he was offering. Robert waited, knowing that this decision had to be hers completely and freely made. He had already betrayed her trust once. She deserved the right to protect herself from further pain if she felt that was necessary. The boys, she said eventually. How do they feel about Miss Patterson? Are they happy with the new arrangement? Robert's laugh was bitter and brief. They're like little robots going through the motions of childhood. They eat their vegetables, do their homework, and go to bed when they're told. But they don't laugh anymore, Margaret. They don't run to greet me when I come home. They don't ask for stories or beg for extra time or get excited about weekend plans. Miss Patterson manages them beautifully, but she doesn't love them. And children know the difference. And you? Margaret asked quietly. What do you need from me if I come back? What's different this time? Robert met her gaze directly, recognizing this as the moment of absolute truth between them. I need a partner in raising those boys. I need someone who will call me on my mistakes and celebrate their victories and help me figure out how to love them better. I need someone who sees them as miracles rather than responsibilities, who remembers their childhood with joy instead of duty. He took a deep breath before continuing. and I need the chance to explore what's been growing between us, slowly, carefully, with complete honesty about our feelings and our fears. I'm not asking you to replace Isabella or compete with her memory. I'm asking if you're willing to help me discover what love can look like after loss, what family can mean when it's built on choice and commitment rather than biology and obligation. Margaret was crying openly now, but her tears seemed to be washing away months of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "Those boys," she said through her tears, "are the lights of my life, loving them, caring for them, watching them grow. It's not my job, Robert. It's my calling. It's what gives my life meaning and purpose." "I know," he said softly. "I've known for months. I was just too scared and proud to admit it." "And us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about us?" Robert lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that felt both intimate and reverent. "I can't promise it will be simple. I can't promise I won't struggle with guilt or confusion sometimes. But I can promise that my feelings for you are real, that they've been growing for longer than I was willing to admit, and that I want the chance to explore them honestly and openly." Margaret was quiet for another long moment, then smiled through her tears. The first genuine smile he had seen from her since that distant evening when he had watched her tell stories to his enchanted sons. "Those boys are going to be so excited to see me," she said, and Robert felt his heart soar with relief and joy. 3 days later, Margaret Collins returned to the Langston mansion. Robert had spent the intervening time preparing Michael and Luke for her homecoming, though he needn't have worried about their reaction. When her taxi pulled into the circular driveway, both boys burst through the front door and raced toward her with shouts of pure joy. She barely had time to set down her suitcase before they launched themselves into her arms, clinging to her with the desperate relief of exile who had finally been allowed to come home. "We missed you so much," Michael sobbed against her shoulder, his 8-year-old composure completely abandoned. "I prayed for you to come back every night," Luke added, his face buried in the soft fabric of her cardigan. Margaret held them both as if they were the most precious things in the world, her own tears flowing freely as she whispered promises that she would never leave them again, that their love for each other was stronger than any temporary separation, that some bonds could never truly be broken, no matter what mistakes adults might make. Robert watched this reunion from the front steps, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Miss Patterson stood beside him with professional composure, her suitcases already packed for departure. She had accepted his explanation with brisk understanding. Family circumstances had changed. Her services were no longer required. He would provide excellent references for future positions. She bore no resentment toward the household's shifting dynamics, having recognized from the beginning that she was a temporary solution to a permanent need. That evening, Margaret prepared dinner in the kitchen that had once felt like forbidden territory. She made the boys' favorite, spaghetti and meatballs with garlic bread, filling the house with aromas that immediately transformed its atmosphere from sterile to welcoming. Michael and Luke helped with every step, chattering nonstop about the months of experiences they had stored up to share with her, their personalities emerging from hibernation like flowers blooming after winter. Robert joined them for dinner, a departure from his usual practice of eating alone in his office after the children had been served. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and stories, feeling like the family meal he had never quite managed to create before Margaret's first departure. She asked the boys about their schoolwork, their friends, their hopes for summer vacation, treating each answer with the serious attention that made them feel truly heard and valued. After dinner, Margaret supervised baths and bedtime routines with the gentle efficiency that had characterized her original tenure, but with new depth and warmth that reflected her understanding of how precious and fragile these rituals were. She read bedtime stories with voices that brought characters to life, sang lullabies that wrapped around the children like audible hugs, and offered prayers of gratitude for the simple miracle of being together again. When the boys were finally settled and peaceful, Margaret found Robert in his office, where he was pretending to review documents while actually listening to the sounds of domestic harmony being restored throughout his house. She knocked softly on the doorframe, waiting for his invitation to enter. "How does it feel?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Having life back in the house?" Robert set aside the papers he hadn't been reading and smiled at her with an openness that would have been impossible before their conversation at the coffee shop. Like coming back to life after months of just surviving. "I didn't realize how much of myself I had lost along with you until tonight, watching them be themselves again." "They're resilient," Margaret observed. "Children are remarkable that way. They can forgive and love and trust again, even after being hurt. We could learn from them." "I'm trying to," Robert admitted, starting with admitting that I was wrong to let fear and pride drive my decisions about our family, starting with acknowledging that what we have here, all of us together, is worth protecting and nurturing instead of questioning and undermining. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but hopeful. "What do you want this to look like, Robert? Our relationship, the boys' understanding of our family structure, the way we navigate loving them and potentially loving each other?" It was a complex question that deserved a thoughtful answer. Robert had spent the last 3 days considering exactly these issues, trying to envision a future that honored everyone's needs while avoiding the mistakes that had led to their painful separation. "I want us to be partners in every sense," he said carefully. "Equal voices in decisions about the boys' education, discipline, activities, future planning. I want them to understand that you're not just someone who takes care of them while I'm at work. You're someone who loves them completely and has equal authority in this family." He paused, organizing his thoughts around the more delicate aspects of their potential relationship. "As for us, I want the freedom to explore what's possible without hiding it from them or pretending it's not happening. Children are intuitive about love. They'll sense it whether we acknowledge it or not. I'd rather be honest about our feelings while being age-appropriate about how we express them." Margaret nodded approvingly. "I agree. They need to see healthy adult relationships modeled for them. They need to understand that love can grow in different ways at different times, that honoring one person's memory doesn't prevent you from caring deeply about another person who's present in your life." "Will it be difficult for you?" Robert asked with gentle concern. "Living in the house Isabella decorated, sleeping in the room next to where she used to sleep, helping raise the children she'll never see grow up." Margaret considered the question seriously, recognizing its importance for their future success as a family unit. "I think it would be more difficult to love you and them from a distance than to love you while surrounded by reminders of how precious life is and how important it is to cherish the time we have together. Isabella's presence in this house isn't a threat to me. It's a reminder that this family knows how to love deeply and that there's room in that love for me too." Over the following weeks, the Langston household settled into new rhythms that felt both familiar and transformed. Margaret resumed her routines with the boys, but Robert made himself far more available for shared activities and decisions. He ate breakfast with them before work, reading while they completed homework in the evenings, and reserved weekends for family adventures that might include visits to museums, hikes in the canyon, or simple afternoons playing board games in the living room. Most importantly, Robert began to court Margaret with the careful attention of a man who understood that love after loss required different skills than young romance. He brought her flowers from the garden she had once tended in secret, listened to her stories about her childhood and dreams with genuine fascination, and shared his own vulnerabilities about fatherhood and grief with increasing openness. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, with the boys as witnesses to the patient tenderness that characterized mature love. The breakthrough moment came on a Sunday evening in late summer when they were all settling down for dinner on the back patio overlooking the garden. Michael, now 9 years old and growing more perceptive every day, looked around the table with obvious satisfaction and made an observation that stopped all conversation. "This feels like we're a real family now," he announced with the authority of childhood insight. "Like, Margaret isn't just someone who takes care of us, and Daddy isn't just someone who pays for things, and Luke and I aren't just kids who live here. We're all together because we want to be together." Luke, slightly younger but equally observant, nodded emphatically. "Margaret loves us and Daddy loves us and we love everybody and everybody loves everybody. That's what families are supposed to feel like." Robert felt tears prick his eyes as he realized his sons had articulated something he had been struggling to define. This was what family felt like when it was built on choice and commitment rather than duty and obligation. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to grow naturally rather than being constrained by fear and social expectations. That night, after the boys were asleep, Robert and Margaret walked in the moonlit garden where Michael had once been lost, and Margaret had found him. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Sometimes people had to be lost before they could be truly found. Sometimes families had to break before they could heal stronger than before. "I love you," Robert said simply, the words carrying no desperation or uncertainty, just quiet conviction. "I love who you are with my sons, who you are with me, who you are in the world. I love your strength and your gentleness and your ability to see beauty and possibility even after experiencing loss and disappointment." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her face luminous in the soft California moonlight. "I love you too," she replied with equal simplicity. "I love your willingness to grow, to admit mistakes, to put your children's happiness above your pride. I love the man you're becoming and the father you're learning to be." They kissed then, their first real kiss, surrounded by jasmine and roses and the promise of tomorrows they would build together. It was a kiss that tasted of healing and hope, of love that had survived testing and emerged stronger than before. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning when Los Angeles wore its winter best of clear skies and cool breezes, Robert called the boys into his office for what he described as an important family meeting. Michael and Luke entered with the slight wariness that important family meetings typically inspired, but Margaret's presence in the room reassured them that this was likely to be good news rather than disappointment. "You know that Margaret and I love each other very much," Robert began, sitting on the edge of his desk so he was closer to their eye level. "And you know that we both love you too more than anything in the world. We've been talking about how to make our family even stronger and more official." "Are you going to get married?" Michael asked with 9-year-old directness, his question carrying excitement rather than concern. Robert smiled at his son's perceptiveness. "We're thinking about it. But before we make any decisions, we wanted to know how you two would feel about Margaret becoming your stepmother officially, not just in our hearts." Luke's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That would be the best thing ever. Can we call her Mom if she marries you?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears of joy and gratitude. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," she said softly. "What matters is that we'll be a family in every way that counts, officially and legally and forever." "Will you adopt us?" Michael asked, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding that came from growing up in a world where family structures took many forms. "So you'll be our real mom too, not just our stepmom?" The question revealed depths of longing that Margaret hadn't fully recognized. These boys didn't just want her as their father's wife. They wanted her as their mother, their official and legal and permanent parent. The idea moved her beyond words. "If that's what you want," she managed through her tears, "and if your father agrees, I would be honored to adopt you both. I would love nothing more than to be your mother in every way possible." Robert was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the perfection of this moment and these people who had taught him what love could accomplish when given room to grow. "I can't think of anything that would make me happier than making Margaret officially part of our family, and making us officially her family too." The wedding took place the following spring in the garden where they had found each other, where Margaret had first saved Michael, and later saved them all from the emptiness that had threatened to consume their house. It was a small ceremony, attended by close friends, and the few family members who understood that love could take many forms and bloom in seasons other than youth. But the most meaningful moment came not during the exchange of vows, but afterward, when the judge, overseeing Margaret's adoption of the boys, asked Michael and Luke if they understood what was happening and if they were happy about gaining a new mother. "She's not new," Luke corrected with 8-year-old wisdom that left the adults amazed. "She's been our mom in our hearts for a really long time. Now it's just official." Michael nodded agreement. "She's the person who loves us most in the world besides Daddy. She's the person who takes care of us when we're sick and celebrates with us when good things happen and helps us be brave when we're scared. That's what moms do." 5 years later, the Langston family had grown to include a daughter, Isabella Rose, named for Robert's first wife with Margaret's wholehearted blessing. The little girl brought new joy to a household that had learned to treasure the ordinary miracles of daily love and shared commitment. Michael and Luke, now teenagers, had grown into young men who understood both the fragility and the resilience of families, who had learned that love could survive loss, and that second chances were gifts to be cherished rather than taken for granted. Margaret worked part-time at the community center where Robert had found her, running programs for single mothers and children from struggling families. Her background in domestic work and child care made her uniquely qualified to understand the challenges faced by women trying to balance multiple jobs while raising children with limited resources. The scholarship fund Robert had established in her name had grown substantially, providing education and support for dozens of families throughout East Los Angeles. But perhaps most importantly, the Langston household had become known among their friends and community as a place where love was celebrated rather than hidden, where children learned that families could be built from choice as well as biology, where loss and healing coexisted in healthy balance. Margaret's portrait hung in the main hallway, not as employee recognition, but as family patriarch, her gentle smile watching over the daily comings and goings of people who had learned that sometimes the most precious gifts were the humblest packaging. On quiet evenings, when the chaos of teenage schedules and baby routines finally settled into peaceful silence, Margaret and Robert would often walk in their moonlit garden and marvel at the unexpected ways their lives had intertwined. She had come to their house as hired help and stayed as chosen family. He had hired her to manage his children's daily needs and discovered she could heal his own wounded heart. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret asked one such evening, little Isabella sleeping peacefully in her arms, "what would have happened if you hadn't come looking for me? If pride had kept us apart forever?" Robert considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Margaret's insights. "I think we would have spent the rest of our lives missing each other without fully understanding what we were missing. The boys would have grown up competent but not cherished, successful but not nurtured. I would have built more wealth but never learned what it means to be truly rich." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The best things in life, love, family, the sense of belonging somewhere and to someone, they can't be bought or earned through achievement. They can only be received as gifts and treasured as daily miracles. As they walked back toward the house that had once felt like a beautiful prison and now felt like the center of the universe, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her from loss to love, from invisibility to belonging, from the edges of other people's families to the heart of her own. She thought about all the women like her, the nannies, housekeepers, caregivers, and homemakers who poured their hearts into loving other people's children and maintaining other people's homes, often without recognition or appreciation. She thought about how easy it was for society to overlook the emotional labor that women like her provided, to treat their devotion as professional service rather than sacred calling. She thought about how many women carried the invisible wounds of loving without acknowledgement, of serving without gratitude, of giving themselves completely to families who saw them as replaceable rather than irreplaceable. But she also thought about the quiet power that came from loving without conditions, from serving without resentment, from maintaining dignity in the face of invisibility. She thought about how that love, even when unacknowledged, changed lives and shaped hearts and created ripples of healing that extended far beyond what anyone could measure or calculate. Most importantly, she thought about hope, the hope that every woman who had ever felt unseen or unappreciated might someday find herself not just acknowledged, but celebrated, not just tolerated, but treasured, not just employed, but beloved. She thought about the hope that every act of selfless love, no matter how small or unnoticed, had the power to transform both giver and receiver in ways that could never be predicted or controlled. And you, have you ever poured your heart into caring for someone who forgot your worth? Have you ever loved children who learned to take your devotion for granted? Have you ever wondered if the work you do with your hands and heart truly matters to anyone? Tell me your story in the comments, because I promise you, your love has left marks that will never fade. Your service has created miracles you may never see. Your presence in someone's life has made differences that will ripple through generations. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own capacity to love and heal and serve with quiet dignity, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to remember her own worth. For more stories that celebrate the silent heroes who hold families together with their devotion, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey of the heart with us. We'll meet again in the next story, where love conquers fear and invisible angels reveal their wings.